For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors were nomads, wanderers on a planet that was constantly in flux. They followed the great herds, the rhythm of the seasons, and the slow, grinding advance and retreat of massive ice sheets. Imagine a life lived entirely on the move, where home was not a place, but a path. A world where survival meant constantly chasing the horizon, seeking shelter in caves and temporary camps, always at the mercy of a wild and unpredictable Earth. This was the human experience for nearly our entire existence. But then, something profound happened. A change so significant, it would rewrite our destiny and reshape the very surface of the planet. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth began to exhale. The last great ice age was ending. Glaciers that had locked down continents for millennia started to melt, carving out new valleys and feeding vast new river systems. The climate, once violently erratic, began to stabilize. The planet settled, and in this newfound stillness, for the first time in human history, the stage was set for a revolution. We stopped moving. This monumental shift didn't happen everywhere at once, but it ignited in a special place, a lush arc of land we now call the Fertile Crescent. Stretching from the Nile Valley, up through the Levant, and across to the plains of Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq, this region became a cradle of civilization. Here, amidst fertile riverbanks and gentle hills, our ancestors made a discovery that seems simple to us now, but was the single most important breakthrough in our history. They realized that if you took a seed from a wild plant and put it in the ground, it would grow. It wasn't just a random occurrence. It was a predictable, repeatable process. They could cultivate their own food. Think about the power of that idea. For the first time, we weren't just taking what nature offered, we were partnering with it. Early farmers began to domesticate wild grasses, nurturing them, selecting the best seeds, and slowly transforming them into the crops we know today. Wheat, barley, rye. They cultivated lentils and peas, creating a reliable, storable food source right outside their doorstep. This was the agricultural revolution, and it was the spark that would ignite the future. With food no longer a constant chase, the very structure of human life began to change. Why roam when your food was rooted in the ground? People began to build permanent homes. They dug storage pits to protect their precious harvests from weather and pests. They constructed hearths that would burn for generations, becoming the heart of a community. Small, scattered clusters of huts slowly grew into villages. These weren't just temporary camps. They were the first true settlements, places like Jericho and Catalyuk, where people were born, lived, and died in the same location. This stability created a ripple effect that touched every aspect of human existence. With a reliable food supply, populations began to grow. For the first time, we had a surplus. Not everyone had to be a farmer or a hunter. This opened the door for specialization. Some people could focus on becoming better builders. Others could perfect the art of pottery, creating vessels to store grain and water. Others became weavers, toolmakers, or spiritual leaders. Society was becoming complex. Fire, once just a source of warmth and a way to cook meat, was transformed into a powerful tool of industry. We learned to use its intense heat to fire clay into durable pottery. We discovered how to smelt ores, extracting copper and later bronze to forge stronger tools and weapons. Fire became the engine of early technology, a force for creation and protection. The rivers that nourished the crops became the first highways. The Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, these weren't just sources of water. They were arteries of trade and communication. People used simple boats to move goods, ideas, and people between burgeoning villages. A network of exchange began to connect communities, weaving them into a larger social fabric. Farms became the bedrock of this new world. They dictated the calendar, with seasons of planting and harvesting. They created concepts of property, inheritance, and law. They were the economic foundation upon which everything else was built. This period, known as the Neolithic Revolution, was more than just a change in diet. It was a fundamental shift in the human relationship with the earth. We were no longer just another species living within the environment, we were actively shaping it. We cleared forests for fields, we diverted rivers for irrigation, and we built structures that would outlast us for millennia. We were starting to tame the wild. This newfound power brought new challenges. Living in close quarters meant diseases could spread more easily. A failed harvest could mean starvation for an entire village. Social hierarchies began to form. leading to inequality and conflict. But the momentum was unstoppable. The villages grew larger, more organized. Walls were built for defense, temples were raised for worship, and granaries were constructed to manage the community's wealth. Leaders emerged to organize large-scale projects, like irrigation canals, and to settle disputes. The simple village was evolving into something bigger, something more dynamic. It was becoming the city. And with the city came writing mathematics, astronomy, law, and government. The foundations of modern civilization were being laid, stone by stone, idea by idea. What started with a single seed planted in the soil of the Fertile Crescent had blossomed into a completely new way of life. It was the end of a world that had lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. The world of the wanderer. And it was the dawn of the world we inhabit today. World of cities, nations, and technology, all built on the legacy of those first farmers. They were the true pioneers, the architects of our settled existence. They took the monumental risk of staying put, of trusting the land, and in doing so, they transformed not only their own lives, but the future of all humanity. They stopped being just survivors and became creators, turning wandering tribes into the builders of worlds. This wasn't just a change in history, it was the moment we started to remake the planet in our own image. As the great ice sheets of the last ice age finally retreated, our ancestors stepped into a warmer, greener world. They had already mastered fire, a skill that pushed back the darkness and cooked their food. Now, they were on the brink of another revolution, one that would change humanity forever. They learned to work the land. Instead of constantly moving, chasing herds, and gathering whatever nature offered, people started to settle down. They planted seeds in the fertile soil near rivers, watched them grow, and harvested their own food. This was farming. It was a game changer. For the first time, there was a surplus, a guarantee of food that wasn't there before. These small clusters of families huddled by the rivers and fields were no longer just temporary camps. They were becoming communities, and with every passing season, these communities grew. More food meant more people, and more people meant that not everyone had to be a farmer or a hunter. New roles began to emerge. There were potters, toolmakers, builders, and weavers. New skills were developed, and new ideas began to spark. What began as tiny farming villages soon pulsed with a new kind of energy. They became hubs of trade where different groups could exchange goods and stories. They became centers of craft where beautiful and useful things were made. They were places for gathering, for worship, and for discovering a shared purpose. Humanity had taken its first major step away from the wild world that had shaped it for hundreds of thousands of years. We were now entering a new world, a human-made world we were just beginning to create. The ancient rivers that had first drawn people to their banks now became the lifelines of culture and commerce. Simple homes of mud and reeds started to line up, forming the first streets. Piles of stones, once just landmarks, were now arranged into great monuments, symbols of power and belief. And perhaps most importantly, the simple symbols people carved into wet clay to keep track of their grain or livestock would evolve into the first true writing. History could now be recorded. This was the moment, the pivotal point when villages filled with new ideas and growing populations transformed into the very first cities. Imagine a world reborn. The last ice age had retreated, leaving behind a warmer, wetter planet. The great rivers, like the Tigris and Euphrates, flowed steadily, carving paths through the land. For humanity, this was a new beginning. The days of wandering, of following the herds and seasons, were drawing to a close. A profound change was quietly taking root, a revolution not of weapons, but of seeds and soil. This was around 12,000 years ago. All across the Fertile Crescent, small, scattered camps of hunter-gatherers were making a monumental choice. They began to settle down. They learned to cultivate the wild grasses that grew around them, to select the best seeds, and to plant them in the rich alluvial soil. These first tentative farms were the seeds of a new kind of society. The small camps grew into permanent villages. These weren't just temporary shelters anymore. They were homes built to last, clustered together for safety and community. As generations passed, these villages expanded. The secrets of farming were refined, passed down from parent to child. The most successful villages grew into bustling towns, hubs of activity and innovation. And then, something extraordinary happened. The largest of these towns began to transform into something the world had never seen before. the first cities. Places like Eridu, Uruk, and Uruz from the Mesopotamian plains, monuments to human ingenuity. Picture these ancient cities. They weren't built of steel and glass, but of the very earth they stood upon. People gathered clay from the riverbanks, mixed it with straw, and formed it into bricks. They left these bricks to bake hard under the relentless sun. With these simple, sun-dried bricks, they built everything: their homes, their granaries, their temples. The houses were packed tightly together, separated by narrow, winding streets that twisted and turned like the rivers themselves. Life was lived in close quarters, a constant hum of human activity echoing through the alleyways. But building a city in a dry land presented a huge challenge. How do you feed thousands of people when rainfall is scarce and unpredictable? The answer lay in the rivers. These early city dwellers became masters of water engineering. They dug intricate networks of canals and irrigation channels, diverting the life-giving water from the Tigris and Euphrates out into the surrounding plains. They turned parched, cracked earth into lush, fertile fields. The golden waves of wheat and barley they grew were a testament to their skill and cooperation. This mastery of irrigation led to a breakthrough that would change the course of human history: the agricultural surplus. For the first time, people could produce more food than they needed just to survive. The granaries were full. This surplus was a safety net, a buffer against famine and drought. But it was also a catalyst for profound social change. With a reliable food supply, not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. A new world of possibilities opened up. Some people could now dedicate their lives to other crafts and professions. Potters learned to shape clay on a wheel, creating storage jars, plates, and cups in ever greater numbers. Weavers turned wool and flax into cloth. Builders and architects designed more complex structures, including massive temples called ziggurats that reached towards the heavens. This was the birth of specialization. Society began to stratify. You had farmers tilling the fields, but you also had artisans in their workshops, merchants organizing trade caravans, and soldiers to protect the city walls. A new class of people emerged: priests who acted as intermediaries with the gods, and healers who used herbs and early forms of medicine to treat the sick. Life was no longer just a daily struggle for survival. It became a complex web of interconnected roles and skills. It was about craft, about trade, about knowledge. And to manage this increasingly complex society, another monumental invention was needed. Imagine trying to keep track of thousands of bushels of grain, hundreds of trade deals, and a growing list of laws, all just by memory. It was impossible. The solution came in the form of simple marks pressed into wet clay. This was the dawn of writing. It began with pictures, simple pictograms representing objects: a head of barley, a jar of oil, a sheep. But over time, these symbols became more abstract, representing sounds and ideas. This cuneiform script, as we call it, was revolutionary. For the very first time in history, human knowledge could be recorded. It could be stored, copied, and shared across vast distances and through time. A trade agreement, a king's decree, a sacred hymn, or a hero's epic story, none of it had to die with the person who knew it. Memory was no longer confined to the fragile human mind. It was etched in stone and clay. With specialization in writing, cities became dynamic centers of power and culture. Great walls were built around them, not just for defense against rival cities or nomadic raiders, but as powerful statements of identity and strength. Inside these walls, life was vibrant. Markets buzzed with traders from distant lands, their stalls filled with exotic goods like lapis lazuli from the mountains and cedar wood from far-off forests. At the heart of the city, both literally and figuratively, was the temple. These weren't just places of worship. They were the economic and administrative centers. Priests and scribes managed the city's wealth, organized labor for public works, and maintained the sacred calendars that governed planting and harvesting. A new political structure also emerged. Rulers, kings, and councils made laws, dispensed justice, and led their armies in an endless dance of diplomacy, trade, and conflict with neighboring city-states. The human world was now expanding at a speed never before imaginable. Ambition, cooperation, and conflict were the engines of this new urban age. The ancient wanderers, who had once roamed the earth in small, scattered bands, had become builders. They had laid down roots, raised walls, and constructed a new reality for themselves. And in doing so, these builders were becoming something more: something grander and more complex than anything that had come before. They were becoming the world's first civilizations. The stage was set for empires to rise, for knowledge to flourish, and for the incredible, tumultuous story of humanity to truly begin. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey back in time fascinating, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about our incredible past.